This phenomenon is telling us that the whole of reality ain't necessarily simple, but it may be simple in the sense that it's our categories, our Western need to divide it into A or B. If we could relax that boundary and see that it might be both A and B.
Author Keith Thompson is an independent journalist, talk radio host, former TV talk show host, and former U.S. Senate staff member. He spent decades researching and investigating UFO encounters and other unknown aerial phenomena. His book, The UFO Paradox, The Celestial and Symbolic World of Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. The first book that I read, I had a chance to check out. We're talking about the UFO Paradox, which is the current book, but Angels and Aliens, and that's UFOs and the Mythic Imagination. When you wrote that book, my takeaway was that there was a really desperate search for a single definition solution. And so here we are, that book, early 1990s, and here we are, 2024. We haven't gone much further, have we?
Well, in the sense that the first book touched on the search for a single solution, that wasn't my approach, but that's what I wrote about. I wrote about how the field seems to feel the need to, there must be some conclusive, definitive thing, and I made that very assumption that we would get final answers that would be consistent with, we all love categorical, definitive stuff. So I said this phenomenon outfoxes us in that regard and is requiring us to rethink that set of assumptions. So now in the new book, the UFO Paradox, I kind of shift gears and I say, what's really going on here? I focus on what philosophers call the ontology. Well, what are the nature of these events that seem to cross over so, as I like to say, promiscuously across the border, the line that's supposed to keep mental phenomena and physical phenomena separate. They're not supposed to cross. But the UFO phenomenon and paranormal phenomena in general do cross over that line in the form of what the psychologist Carl Jung called synchronicities, meaningful connections where, you're sitting there and say, I've not heard from John for 20 years, and the phone rings and it's John from high school. That's a synchronicity. There's a convergence of mental and physical, and that can only be called coincidence in the materialist worldview. But in a worldview where everything seems to be infused with consciousness, that's normal. And I think the UFO phenomenon, whatever fully is going on, is a phenomenon that partakes of that and confounds the Western division between mind and matter pretty deeply.
Well, another quote from Jung is, something is seen, but one doesn't know what. And that's really, I think, the crux, is that we are seeing something, and in trying to identify it, we all have different terms, different language, different ideologies, the whole 9 yards of diverse opinions and ideas, experiences, and trying to put that in one pot. UFO is still a really vague term.
It really is. In fact, UFO was supposedly was going to help free the phenomena from all those connotations and multiple interpretations. Let's call it unidentified flying objects. But even all of those three terms beg the question. It's unidentified in terms of what? It's unidentified in terms of categories. We can eliminate hoax, hallucination, and misidentification, at least when we can eliminate those. Sometimes it does reduce to those. Some people see Venus or Mars and think they saw something extraordinary. So you take those out of the equation. It's unidentified in terms of what we can recognize it to be. And it's flying. Well, it's airborne. Seems to be flying. It's airborne, but it's also seen to be coming in and out of water, bodies of water, these apparent craft. And then object. That's the funniest one, because it does appear in some of its phases, sometimes manifests, and it's picked up on radar and other forms of physiological measurement. It appears to occupy a geometric space, which is a good criterion. It produces turbulence. It causes indentations on the ground, and even in some witnesses, burns the skin. It's a pretty good qualifier for physical. And yet that same apparent object in its next phase, and while it's being beheld, it will split into two or three of it, or turn into balls of light, some of which descend into the ground. It's really like the genre of movies you're probably familiar with, magical realism. By that, I mean, say, unlike Harry Potter, where it's all fantasy from the very get-go, magical realism starts with realistic scenarios, people in the village living ordinary lives. But then there are hints of magic that appear in the storyline, and it's assumed that magic is sort of part of the reality. That kind of movie, that kind of storyline is very consistent with what this phenomenon is. It comes seemingly from another world or another realm, interacts with our realm, and then disappears again.
Jacques Vallée had a book, Masters of Deception. I want to bring, there's some other research in here about, and basically things that happen to people that they believe, whether it's in a dream plane or just out-of-body state, like an instance where a man thought he was pregnant and he gained 16 pounds and demonstrated, that his body interpreted whatever his mind, something was telling him. His body manifested that state. There's other examples of that. So that's what makes it so complicated, is that how do you separate the mind of the experiencer from the reality that everybody else wants to see? How do you get concrete versus non-physical?
Well, it's a kind of a both and I will be the first to say I don't have final answers. A big part of what I wanted to do was to include all the phenomena. By that I mean there's a bias among some UFO researchers you may know of. I don't mean to be vague about their names, but there's some who prefer the nuts and bolts extraterrestrial hypothesis that it's physical craft, which it can be interpreted as in many cases. These tend to be people who have engineering backgrounds or engineering focus, so they are therefore inclined toward the part of the phenomena that can be explained in terms of their interpretive grid. Oh, I'm an engineer. I want to see things that make sense to me as an engineer. And if I say to them, well, across the quad there, here on the University of Reality, there's a department of psychology. He said, well, I don't like going over there. I don't like what they study. Why not? Well, because it makes it too messy. Messy. Wow. Say more about messy. Well, I want the parameters to be simple. Well, that's the point. This phenomenon is telling us that the whole of reality ain't necessarily simple, but it may be simple in the sense that it's our categories, our Western need to divide it into A or B. If we could relax that boundary and see that it might be both A and B. I know that's still somewhat abstract. I'll give you an example of a witness named Dennis Sant, S-A-N-T. I don't cite his name because he became famous, but in relationship to the Hudson Valley sightings in New York State back in the 80s, he was it was a total UFO flap, as they call it, just a large number of paranormal UFO-type activity. And for a period of 20 minutes, he sat in his car and watched an apparent craft, almost like something out of Steven Spielberg. And during that 20-minute period, he later reported, he was astonished to find that he was doing a complete life review. He was even reliving his life in ways that was beyond his comprehension, with a sense of larger panoramic understanding that is actually quite similar, as you may know, to the near-death experience, when people who have died or approached the boundary between life and death very often are put through a life review, a reliving of their life, with a deep sense of wisdom and compassion for all the players and all aspects of their lives. So he commented later, why would it be that if I saw something in the sky separate from me, it should evoke, as it seemed to evoke, this kind of deep connection within myself to mysteries that almost seem cosmic? And that is the question. Whatever it is somehow telling us that the realm of mind, consciousness, and matter are deeply embedded, and that is how paranormal phenomena work. If you know the phone ringing and a name comes to mind, materialist science is, oh, that's a coincidence. Nothing significant, just a coincidence. But the sheer number of these coincidences start to add up. There are so many realms, as you say, about the man who wanted to give birth in a medical scenario that this was studied and written about. He had a great desire to give birth. He felt in his body something moving like a baby. During the next 3 weeks, his abdomen became more and more distended. He gained 16 pounds without altering his diet. There was no pathology to account for the growth. Now, what does a story like that have to do with UFOs? It is in both cases the power of mind. Well, in this case, his intentionality, a bizarre scenario. He wanted to give birth. He was diagnosed as a schizophrenic. So that's the framework. This is a mental hospital. But in that deep desire to give birth, he began to go through what appeared to be. He did not give birth, of course, but there are so many others. The placebo effect, where a control group and an experimental group are divided. They're both told some will get the real pain relief medicine, if that's what the test is about, the study, and some will get a dummy pill. Nobody knows who. That's why it's double blind. Everybody and the researchers don't know at that point. They all get the medicine, or they all get a pill, either the real medicine or the dummy pill. The result are statistically those who didn't end up not getting the pill have the same benefits as those who did in terms of pain relief. They also, to make it even more remarkable, those who got just the dummy pill also got the side effects of the real medicine. So two sets of effects. What is that? So here's the funny thing about that. The reason I include that story in a book about UFOs, as I'm trying to sort of unwind all of this, is that in those kind of news stories, medical journalism, there's usually a doctor who comes in at the end of the story and says, oh, well, I can comment on that. That's just the placebo effect. And I'm always struck by that. Just the placebo effect. Merely, oh, that's just the placebo. That's just the, I mean, it explains it away. Well, what are you explaining away is the power of expectation. I think I may have gotten the medicine, and then they end up with the same benefits. Yeah. So I've often thought if we could teach people how to manifest the placebo effect, we might have a whole different medical approach where people have greater capacity to stay well or to understand to what extent their illnesses are caused by mental factors, by their attitude toward life. Don't we all know people who really don't have? I mean, don't want to reduce complex medical problems to simply attitude, but there certainly is an attitudinal dimension to well-being. So anyway, I bring in these kind of things to say from many different angles. The phenomenon we call UFOs may be a kind of a harbinger. It's a beckoning to our own larger nature. These phenomena are larger than our framework, and so is a lot of phenomena in our normal human world, such as the placebo effect.
Well, you might have had a touch of that when you were a kid and you had the experience out on the roof.
Exactly. I can tell what that was about. I was completely. I grew up in a family with three brothers, and I had a sort of a predilection to, in addition to time I spent alone or spent time with friends and so forth, had a normal upbringing. I used to like to get away and just sort of find quiet, solitude. And I found that up on the roof of our house, where I was not really supposed to go, climbing up a TV antenna that was built into the ground. In the old days, you'd have these stationary TV antennas that were upright, and it was like a ladder. So, of course, I always would take the bait, and I would climb up. When my parents were at home, I'd climb up on the roof and found a place to just be quiet and calm. And one day while I was just looking into the sky with no intention or with no purpose, I was suddenly had a sense of being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. No particular place, but everywhere. It was as if the line between myself and everything disappeared, and that was perfectly normal. That was the real state of the way things are. I was inexplicably surrounded by a brilliance that blazed through me, and it seemed to lift me beyond time and space. I want to make it very clear. I'm not making a claim that I achieved anything or accomplished anything. It was almost the opposite. There was no doing. It was simply being. And I didn't come away as a prophet, but I did know that this emanated from a source that lies beyond each of us, but it also permeates everything that is. And I said, this is home ground. This is center court. This is God. This is spirit. This is soul. And I want to emphasize to listeners, we did not grow up in a particularly religious family. We went to church, but we were very nominally religious. It was more like the idea of it's good for good people to be seen at church. Good people would be seen as going to church. So we weren't particularly devout. I had not had much religious education, but I came down from the roof that day. I didn't go inside and say to my parents, oh, guess what? I just experienced that the line between me and the rest of the universe diminished. And this is true for all of us. That would not have been welcome. I mean, there wasn't a time when people were medicated easily, but my parents might have sent me away for some medication. So I kept that to myself because I actually felt I had experienced not anything I needed to be sheepish about. But the only thing to be sheepish about was talking about it, because I knew that the ordinary people wouldn't understand. And so, but I knew that I was in on something that many people did understand, and that became even more clear to me as I got interested in spirituality, read people like Alan Watts, the great theologian who looked at Eastern and Western models, and went on meditation retreats eventually, found that same peace and spaciousness in quiet sanctuaries and redwoods and in the company of seagulls at the beach. So I gradually said, okay, this wasn't unique to being on the beach, or excuse me, being on the roof. Somebody later said, oh, you had an experience of the consciousness of the sky. I said, no, it wasn't the consciousness. He said, it was a larger intelligence in the sky. I said, no, it was just like looking into the sky, letting go and not looking at the sky, just releasing any effort and kind of gently gazing at the sky. The sky became a framework for my mind to settle, I think.
Yeah.
Into the recognition that behind all the apparent objects is the space in which the objects appear. And then I later found out, reading the literature of Alan Watts and reading the literature of mysticism, I said, this is a form of reality comprehension called mysticism. So people say, have you ever seen a UFO? I said, well, no, but I'm one day looking at the sky. So there is a strange way in which, even though I've never had a UFO experience, that momentary, and not the only time that happened. That's this kind of relaxing of the boundaries. And I haven't had that stark sense of recognition, as I described, very often. But it still just seems to be the ground of who we are. And then who we seem to be most of the time is not false, but it's not the full story. That's the point. There is a separate self. I have a name and you have a name. We have driver's licenses and separate identities. But there are those moments when we realize those are just a form of moving through this world, and that there is frankly, the soul level. And I think if we make contact with the soul level and we have a framework of openness to it, I didn't try to interpret what had happened to me at age 14, by the way. So developmentally, I didn't have much orientation to religious experience. I didn't have a family that taught me that I would have these kind of experiences. So it was just a recognition that I felt I'd looked behind the curtain, like in The Wizard of Oz, and had seen more of what really is. And I think that's what's happening in the UFO framework. The encounters with aliens, quote unquote, are real. I don't think they're invented. But the nature of that reality, in what realm are people abducted and taken up through the ceilings of their homes into what seems to be a craft? It's described by other people who have the same experience, but not often as anybody else in the same neighborhood do they see the craft. But sometimes they are missing from bed. So there are many wrinkles in all of this that make any single hypothesis difficult. But I would say the one hypothesis that is easiest to dismiss is that which is I call debunking. The mere debunking attitude, as opposed to genuine skepticism, a certain kind of toxic skepticism that dismisses it all in advance. And these are these people in the name of science who were often brought in the third segment of an Oprah episode. Now we turn to the expert, a physicist from the department of such and such at the University of such and such, who will say, I've studied these abductions, and they are really a form of neurosis. They are a form of hope. Wannabe. These people have all seen UFO movies and blah, 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 blah. I go, that's not an answer, because that actually, the idea that all alien abductees have a pre-existing pathological mental condition. Dr. John Mack of Harvard, a psychiatrist, put that idea aside. But we're dealing with something that's requiring us to put aside our easy explanations and ask better questions.
I think I've heard somebody say that the debunker is somebody who offers a pronouncement without evidence, just going in and basically slamming it without ever having done any kind of boots on the ground evidence, going out and investigating a site, doing anything like that, because in some ways it's too difficult. That's actually hard.
Yeah, it really is. There's an example of that in the Pascagoula, Mississippi abduction case I write about. One of the two men who had this experience, neither of whom was well educated, neither of whom was well versed in psychology or so forth. There was a legendary debunker named Philip Klass, who's no longer around, but he would jet into these communities and call the media and say he was here to pronounce. And one of the, Calvin Parker, one of the men, he said to Klass with his southern accent at a TV studio, he said, "You have called me a fraud. You say I'm conducting a hoax, but you have never come to my house and sat on my porch with me and asked me what happened. And you call yourself a scientist? Well, I'm not educated like you may be, but I know that can't be how science works." It was beautiful. It was beautiful. And I use the accent just so any Southerners listening know that I do so with great respect. I like the Deep South, and I spent time with Calvin Parker near the end of his life 2 years ago. He passed about a year ago, but remarkable. And near the end of his life, near the end of my visit with him, he said, I asked him, "What's it like not to be believed?"
Yeah.
And something like that. He said, "Well, I understand. I've come to see how the disbelievers work. I don't know if I would believe this if it hadn't happened to me. So I don't expect them to believe it if they haven't had something like this, and I don't wish it on any of them. I continue to say, if you check my history of comments on this, I haven't changed my view. I haven't elaborated on it or amplified it or all the other terms they think that I'm adding details. That happens in some cases. People try to make it a better story. I tell the same story, just what happened." And he said, "I don't know what happened, where they came from, but I do know something came and something happened." And by the way, after he finally agreed reluctantly to write a book, he'd had published, "Would you tell your story about the famous Pascagoula abduction?" He said, "No, I'm not a writer. You'll change my words to make me sound educated or something in a way that I'm not. I don't want to." But he finally agreed to do it. He finally agreed in the last decade of his life to write the book. And only when he did write the book did people come to his book signing there in Pascagoula and said, "Mr. Parker, you hit out so well that I've been waiting to have a chance to tell you that I saw the same object that night here in Pascagoula." And other witnesses came forward. "I saw the lights. I saw something down by the river." So he said, "What a great irony. I was hiding out from this, even with an assumed name for a while. I didn't want any attention as that UFO guy. And what I did in trying to hide out, I managed to stay hidden from people who were trying to contact me to let me know that they could confirm the case if I would just show up, stand still." So the great irony of his life, this calling that had happened to him, which is what I call these events, calls from the cosmos. In some sense, they are a calling from the larger reality we call the cosmos to expand our maps, to expand our concepts. So by finally responding to his call and writing the book that he did write, he was able to make contact with other witnesses. I just think that's a wonderful storyline ending.
Well, didn't he actually sign a funeral register, and that was how his name came out?
Yes, he went to a funeral. He had taken on the name Randy. I don't know what his last name he used, but I don't know. I know he didn't legally change his name, but he moved from town to town and with his wife, and he changed his name to Randy. So he even took jobs as Randy. He was known to people. They thought he was Randy. So one day a family friend or from work had passed, so he and his wife went to the funeral home, and he signed the register, and he wasn't thinking. He signed it Calvin Parker. And someone behind him who signs it, "Well, you're Calvin Parker. This is Calvin Parker, the UFO guy." And he goes, and to his credit, he said to his wife, "This isn't right. This is a man's funeral. We have no business taking up the attention of this. Let's leave. Tell the family we love them, but we're not going to stay." And on the way out to the car, his wife, whose name I forget, I believe it was Wynette.
Yeah.
His wife of 50 years or so, 30 years, said, "Calvin, it's time for you to write that book." And do you know what? He told me, he said, "Mr. Thompson, I not only had not written the book, I had never fully told my wife what had happened. It was so traumatic. I had never given her the details of this." He said, I don't know about your relationships. Can you imagine having a spouse that you do not talk with us about for 30 years? Things don't go well. You bottle that up. So he sat in the parking lot that day at the funeral and said, "Wynette, here's what happened."
Wow.
Charlie and I, we were at the dock, we're fishing. This thing landed, took us in, conducted this investigation. And she said, "Thank you for telling me. I knew you would tell me." Can you imagine the trust it would take for her? That she didn't fear that he was with another woman.
Yeah.
She feared he was with another reality. But she trusted that if he needed to keep it quiet, she would give him that space. So finally told her, he finally wrote the book, finally came out, finally said, "Goodbye, Randy. Been strange to know you, but I don't need you anymore." I think it's a beautiful, beautiful, it almost has Hollywood ending.
Oh, yeah.
To take on an assumed name, not to be associated with this. It's just too good to be true.
Going back to the story that you start out with, Kenneth Arnold's story, the same kind of thing happened. There's one story that the press ran with because a word was nice and shiny and they took it and ran with it. But the real story, he didn't actually get to tell because the other story had already preceded it, and that was shinier. Does that make sense?
It was shinier in more ways than one. It was shiny. He in 1947 near Mount Rainier, Kenneth Arnold, a private pilot, was out searching for a crashed airplane, trying to recover the wreckage. I don't think he succeeded. What he saw instead was 9 objects flying in formation out his cockpit window, his windshield. And he was a very skilled pilot. He knew how to compute the speed of these objects. I believe it was something 1,200 miles an hour, something extraordinary. And he observed that they seemed to skip through the air the way a saucer would skip over water. And I think he called it into the air traffic control or to the tower. And when he was ready to land, when he did land in Pendleton, Oregon that day, June 24th, 1947, there were on the tarmac reporters waiting to talk to him because they called it in, or maybe they'd heard it on the scanner. "What did you see, Mr. Arnold?" And he said something flying like saucers, skipping. The move like saucers would skip over water, like a frisbee, let's say. Touches down and bounces back up. That became, he saw flying saucers, the shape of saucers, which, turns out to be, that's how many of them appear to be. But the more remarkable thing about more remarkable than the difference between their shape and how they move, was he told his daughter something that he did not tell the world. Because what he told the world enough was already strange enough, bringing in saucers, shaped or movement. I'm not going any further than that because he was kind of bedeviled by this for the rest of his life. He was considered to be maybe a kook at best. So, but he told his daughter. His daughter came forward about 20 years later after he passed away and said, "My father was always amazed that people thought that he was talking about technology or nuts and bolts and spacecraft and outer space. It was never anything like that. He told me that he saw 9 objects that appeared to be living. They changed their shape and form. They changed their density from very opaque, like matter, to being more translucent and light shining through them, blue and white. And they had the beat of a heartbeat, the beat of a human heart." And then she added, "My father said he had a deep, deep sense of intuition that these were from another dimension, that is part of reality, but it is probably related to where we go after we die." Whatever that is. Well, that puts it in a frame, not of extraterrestrial, but of the esoteric. Some kind of subtle material, subtle phenomenon, phantom-type phenomenon. And interestingly, one more angle of this. In addition to keeping that to himself, which would have changed the entire, what can you imagine? Well, if he'd come down from his cockpit and told the people on the tarmac at the airport that he'd seen the objects changing their shape and form, and he thought they were from the other world, and where we go after we die, he probably would have been hauled in for a psychiatric examination, maybe lose his flight license. So he went with the simpler mystery, namely that it's saucer or saucer shape, saucer like. But here's the part that is truly phenomenal. He went home that night, and in the days thereafter, after he landed back in Boise, Idaho, where he called home, their house was filled with orbs of light and other spectral phenomena that we would almost think of as a haunting, ghost-like. They weren't terrified of it. But, generally, we don't have lights flashing in the house, balls of light. And that is a common aspect of the UFO phenomenon. The parent craft sometimes morph into these balls of light. But in any case, what matters is he didn't see something localized. He didn't see only something localized over Mount Rainier. Whatever that was already part of his psyche, because he brought it home with him in some sense. Or else the larger field included the distance from Mount Rainier to Boise. But I don't think it was in time and space, as we call it. There was a larger field effect, a non-local effect. And so, of course, he kept that to himself, too. And this is actually a common element in UFO sightings. The poltergeist activity will also take place in the home, and the radios come on and off, the water faucet turns on and off, the clothes, you go out of the house for the evening, you come home and all the clothes are taken out of the closet and placed on the bed. A debunker would say, well, there was a breaking and entering. No, that's not the best explanation. It's not an easy explanation to say poltergeist, because that just causes people to roll their eyes. We've all seen movies involving poltergeists, but turns out, there's a philosopher named Sir William Crook, who studied the paranormal back in Victorian England, and he was challenged by a debunker type. He said, I never said it was possible. I only said it was true. And that's how I am with all this. I don't know that it's possible, but I know that it's true. And I mean true on many levels. The authenticity of someone like Calvin Parker in Mississippi, I would trust him as much as I would trust a family member that I believe to be telling me the truth.
The UFO Paradox, the celestial and symbolic world of unidentified aerial phenomena. Keith's website is thompsonatlarge.com. A quick break. Author Keith Thompson is an independent journalist, a talk radio host, former TV talk show host, and former U.S. Senate staff member. His articles have been in the New York Times, Esquire, San Francisco Chronicle, etc., and he spent decades researching and investigating UFO encounters and other unknown phenomena. You've had a lot of amazing experiences in terms of your hobnobbing with UFO names, like John Mack, who was influenced by your first book to actually go after and study the abduction experience, and ended up studying the kids in Zimbabwe with the Ariel phenomenon. But not only that, there was a big meeting, and this is back when Clinton was president, and you were part of a group with Lawrence Rockefeller trying to determine which way to go with this particular issue and trying to get it more exposure and amplify it. That's a legacy. That's
right. And that's one reason I wrote about these. And my book in many ways approaches the phenomenon from different angles. And I don't regret writing it the way I did, because it's like there were many different strands, almost like, remember back in grade school when you'd have the overhead projector and the teacher would put on a transparency, and you write on the transparency and then that reflects on the wall, etc. Well, just think of numerous transparencies that get laid on top of each other to make an increasingly complex picture. So one of the transparencies for me was, I said, I feel the need to tell some stories that I've been involved with in order to help preserve the history. I want to not lose these lineages of these key people. So I feel blessed, fated, destined. I don't even know if I need any of those words, but blessed is certainly part of it. I've had the opportunity to, by pursuing this subject and going with it, with the high strangeness and all, I have crossed paths with many interesting people, one of whom, the philanthropist from New York City, Lawrence Rockefeller. I received a call from his office one day. He said, Mr. Thompson, I have read your book, Angels and Aliens. You take what I call a big picture approach. And I said, well, thank you. I said, please call me Keith, by the way. And he said, well, then you'll call me Lawrence, and we'll be done with the formalities. And he had a wonderful Middle Atlantic, old patrician accent, which I won't try to do too often. I've come to feel that I have somehow incorporate these people in my life, and not an impressionist, but I can hear his voice, and so I'm almost inclined to talk like him. But in any case, he said, by that I mean, by big picture, you connected up with the near-death phenomenon, you're open to the paranormal. And I said, exactly. I wouldn't have expected these connections. I told him about a sixth grade report I gave as a 12-year-old. It was my turn to give a current events report in class. I chose the UFO phenomenon, a particular sighting in Michigan that was controversial. And my teacher, after telling the class about it, bringing the clippings to class, she said, Mr. Thompson, in a positive way. She said, Mr. Thompson, you've done a very good job here. You have the makings of a reporter, or maybe a scientist, or who knows, maybe a detective. Follow the clues wherever they lead. Follow the evidence in life wherever it leads. And that's true. That's what a detective does. A detective doesn't say, well, there's been a killing at the old mansion. Gather everybody in the room. There's the butler. Well, I like the butler, so I'm going to exclude the butler. No, that isn't how good detective work. You may like the butler, but you don't exclude him from the field, and unless the butler has an alibi, a solid alibi. Well, the same with science. You try to eliminate hypotheses. You try to exclude possibilities, and yet you study the data where it goes. And likewise, good journalism. There's a lot of bad journalism around, pack journalism, herd journalism. But the true journalism, I think of Woodward and Bernstein, and two exemplary journalists who broke one of the biggest political cases, the Watergate.
Yeah.
Interestingly, their editor, Ben Bradley, they would come in and say, we're ready to go with a story about the Nixon administration and the hush money. And he looked and he goes, how many sources you got on this? We got one, but it's really good. And he goes, no. There's no one good source. We need at least two, and preferably three. He said, if we're wrong, Nixon will own the Washington Post. He'll put us out. He'll put us out of business. And so he sent these cub reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, back on the street. And if you've seen the movie with Hal Holbrook, Source in the underground parking garage, follow the money. Check Haldeman. Check Ehrlichman, whatever it was. And so they did, came back, they got the three sources, and they broke the... So you follow the evidence where it leads. When I gave that report in the 6th grade, I didn't know about the paranormal. I didn't know about telepathy, except maybe and clairvoyance and precognition and synchronicities, precognitive dreams. I don't think I'd had any at that point. By the way, it was 2 years later after giving my classroom report that I had this full-blown mystical experience on the rooftop of my family home. So my life is unfolded by, I think there's almost a sense of, if you follow a calling in life, that's a larger message of my book. Follow a calling in your life. Don't follow it blindly. Be willing to renegotiate your path. But if you're called by something and it feels true, checks out in more than one level, that's what a calling is. And people who follow their callings may not always achieve greatness, but they'll do what they're here to do something with purpose and value and meaning. And for me, I have to say that including my own stories in this book was a departure for me, because in my first book, Angels and Aliens, I thought, okay, and because this subject is so far out, I'm going to really try very hard to be very, very credible. So I won't bring in my own experiences, because I don't want people to think I'm trying to justify my own experiences. And in terms of, it would seem to be a kind of a bias. But finally, with this book, I said, your own experience is not intrinsically biased. In a first-person experience, my gosh, a good bit of journalism, some of the best nonfiction we know, is when the writer will say something about their own experience that brings a degree of authenticity to it. So in writing about my own experience as a subtext to the book, it's by no means the primary part of the book, including my own near-death experience that happened in my 20s before I even knew about near-death experiences.
Yeah,
in Hawaii. By bringing all of that in, I think I found a deeper register, and I'm getting that feedback. The book is just out, but I'm hearing from people. They say, you're telling your own story, whether you intended it or not, is a mark of the authenticity of the rest of what you've done. And I think, bingo, I felt that was what the voice in a writer works in solitude, and you learn to listen to the different promptings in your own mind and in the room. I can't say I had any paranormal experiences while writing the book, but I did feel at times I was in dialogue with a larger part of myself. And at one point I said, should I bring my own experience into this book? And the unspoken response was, do you want it to be true? Or are you really willing for it to be true? Meaning the book? And I didn't even have to, I said, yeah, I need to bring this in. There are some people who might still read the book and go, well, what does a near-death experience have to do with the UFO experience? Well, there are two realms that neither, which is well understood.
They intersect.
It points us in, they intersect. That's the main thing. And I try to show the intersections probably in a way we can't probe fully here. But anyway, for me, this is a map. I've tried to draw a map of questions and better questions. How can we use the current questions to get us to even better questions rather than to try to answer everything? Because the material is often so fugitive and elusive, many UFO researchers overcompensate by pretending to have a certainty about it that they don't have. And I can tell when I'm around one of those. I've been in touch with the government. I know what's really going on with the cover-up. I said, well, good. Can you release anything? No, I can't even tell you the names. I'll burn my sources. So everybody has sources and sources and sources, and I think it's a shell game at some point. Or if not, I don't rely on those kind of sources. People say, did you write about disclosure in the book? And I laugh. I go, it's all about disclosure. The ultimate disclosure is the phenomenon itself, the effect it's having, the responses it generates, including the debunkers. All of this is the big disclosure. We're the disclosure. The witnesses are the disclosure. As for what the government knows, I'm not an expert on the tracking what's in the hangars at McDonnell Douglas, or not McDonnell Douglas, McDonnell Douglas Aerospace or
Whiteman,
Lockheed Martin. That's the new story that the researcher David Grush has come up with, and he's a respectable ex-military official. He believes he's onto some really solid evidence that there are recovered craft and recovered dead aliens and they've been passed off to the aerospace companies holding it. Well, it's empirical, right? He's presented the names and dates and locations that he's supposedly been given to the Inspector General of the intelligence community. So apparently they're tracking it down to see if the story stands out. It's a part of the phenomenon I don't explore. I tend to go more toward the philosophical implications for what does this mean for our science. But if I'm open to the possibility that there might be real material in these hidden locations.
There's another intrepid researcher. He's been on this for 30-some years. I think they have 55,000 pages of documents in terms of the research, the Aztec UFO. And that's another one that supposedly involves bodies. And a lot of witnesses, multiple witnesses at various points that this craft crashed, and then there was a retrieval effort, and then people were told to be quiet. These stories are out there. The other thing about that is, though, there at the beginning was so much effort to discredit anyone who said they even saw a UFO. That's why so many people didn't say anything. And now there are more stories, more sightings, more conversation about it. And that didn't happen until 2017.
Well, and that takes me back. I kind of interrupted myself on the Lawrence Rockefeller.
Yeah.
So what Rockefeller had called me to say, Mr. Thompson, or Keith, you call me Keith, I'll call you Lawrence. He said, I'm assembling at my family ranch in Wyoming a meeting in September with leading UFO researchers. We're going to conduct an initiative to the Clinton administration. It was a new administration at the time, 2 years into the Clinton administration. Both Bill and Hillary had expressed interest in the UFO subject, and they said they were going to pursue it. Rockefeller said he's a young president. His administration is new. He seems open to transparency, and then I'd like you to come and join this collaboration so we can brainstorm how to approach the White House. Can you come? And I sort of thought playfully, let me check my schedule and get back to you. No, I can come. I can come
Let
for
me
sure.
check my schedule.
It's not
All right.
question. Yeah, I'm not that busy that weekend in September. So I flew out. And he also said to me something that he said, I'd like you to come about 2 days earlier than everybody else. And he said, I'd like you to come because I've read your book, Angels and Aliens, and these connections to the near-death phenomenon, to the shamanic world, to the indigenous people, to spiritual questions. And then he said, this business of consciousness, he called it the business of consciousness, by which he meant the matter of consciousness, this issue. What is the role in consciousness, intention, belief? What is the line between the mental and the physical? These questions are all up to this. Don't you agree? And I said, I do. Thank you. And I'd be happy to talk to you. I'll just share my questions with you. And he goes, that's all I want. I'm an explorer by temperament. You seem to be too. It was a very, very congenial meeting. I did go out and meet him. So in any case, we gathered after the 2 days of just private talks with him. The others showed up. We had 2 or 3 days. John Mack was part of the conversation. Stephen Greer, the disclosure researcher, Linda Moulton Howe, who studied the cattle mutilations. Really, a lot of the main people were there. And we decided, some said we try to get the Clinton administration to the entire subject of UFOs. And others, and I was in this other group, others of us felt, no, that's way too broad. If you go too broad, it becomes easy to brush it off the table with one big brush. But if we go for like one case like Roswell, and that's what Rockefeller decided. So he sent some letters. The thing about it being Lawrence Rockefeller, it's one of America's first families. It's like the Kennedys. Kennedy, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Mellon. You know, we can have our beliefs about these great imperial families in America, but they are who they are. They are complex family structures, and Lawrence Rockefeller was the Rockefeller brother of his generation, who was particularly interested in philosophy and spirituality and new dimensions in science. He was considered a bit of the outlier. The others were interested in more mainstream. Let's fund health research. Let's fund. Although Lawrence also did a lot in national conservation, protecting wildlife and natural resources. So anyway, we set the Roswell flying, the crash. What happened at Roswell in 1947 as the story. The Clinton administration delved deeply into it. They went to the Pentagon. They issued their requests for the information. There were no demands. There were no hearings. There were no subpoenas. It was just a good faith. Maybe their government would be willing to be more transparent after all the years had passed. But instead, or it depends on what you think really happened, they came back with, we've investigated these claims. There's no reason to question the government's claim that this is a weather balloon. We have no evidence of aliens. Okay, so Rockefeller was disappointed by that response, which didn't ring entirely true. His people around him were more than disappointed. They were very angry at the continuing cover-up. One of them said, Bill Clinton could penetrate to this if he really wanted to, but he's not willing to spend the capital, which frankly is probably true. If you think about it, would a young president want to devote all of his resources, his credibility to going after flying saucers? Depending on what's there, it could be a very dangerous path to take. So in any case, what's interesting, though, is that within the short period thereafter, it was learned that the powers that be, the military intelligence sources, let's put it this way, all of the material related to Roswell suddenly disappeared from files up to 2 years prior to the Roswell incident, which suggests a desire to clear out evidence. Who knows what I speculated in the book. I said, okay, just to be fair, they may have been covering up evidence of Roswell as a crashed flying saucer. It's also possible that maybe there was embezzlement that was going on separate from the crash on the Roswell base that somebody felt that they were going to come out with, so they decided to get rid of all the records. We don't know. I jokingly said in the book, this is something we should send Jack Reacher to check out. And put him on a bus and let him go in and ask all the right questions, and he'd knock the heads he needed to knock in order to. And okay, so it was a good example, a good effort of a public-spirited citizen, Lawrence Rockefeller, trying to open this up, not succeeding, but he didn't think of it as not succeeding. We've made a good attempt, he said, and we will come back another day, another time. He had that kind of eternal optimism and ebullience, and it inspired. I remember near the last conversation we had about a year before he died, he said, Keith, it's been a pleasure working with you on these issues. I hope you will continue to ask questions. And I said, well, I know you will. He said, I will be doing that to the end of my life. And then he reminded me that when we were standing at his ranch and looking out at the Teton Mountains, he said, the wonder never ends. And then we retired to the cabins. Well, he said on that phone call, remember, Keith, the wonder never ends. So it was like a scene with Spencer Tracy or Henry Fonda that young Keith Thompson got to participate in with this legendary public citizen. So all of that's in my book. I tell some stories along those lines.
Well, the other thing, too, is you've tried to be generous in terms of not anybody you're reviewing or possibly objectively criticizing, such as Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, the method that Jacobs came to in terms of his research when it came to the abduction phenomena.
I tried to be very. I understood that my criticism of say David Jacobs in exploring the abductions, he consciously and deliberately tended to minimize witnesses who had spiritual experiences, who had psychic experiences, paranormal, because he didn't believe. Funny, he thought that abductions were real events, but you didn't need a framework that embraced speculative stuff like, quote unquote, speculative stuff like the paranormal. And even then I realized, well, I'm not going to give him a hard time. He genuinely does not understand. There is considerable, not only anecdotal evidence for the paranormal, but good scientific evidence now. A researcher named Dr. Dean Radin, Radin, at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Northern California, is one of the best researchers in laboratory studies of telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition. So the point is, I realized David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins simply did not know the things that I knew, but I realized the danger of what they were doing. They were excluding from their samples. It was called classic selection bias. If you eliminate people based on what you think in advance the phenomenon should and should not include, you are unknowingly biasing your sample. I made the analogy. Imagine Charles Darwin, who discovered evolution by following fossil records and he did natural history. So he could imagine walking along with a knapsack over his shoulder and picking up fossils. And he said, okay, those are 3 interesting fossils. This 4th one doesn't seem to fit the pattern of the first 3. I think I'll leave it. No, he wouldn't do that. He'd pick up the 4th one, and he'd pick up a 5th and a 6th and a 7th. And if the pattern got stranger and bigger, he would probably have reason to think, well, the more samples I collect, the more I'll be able to trust my results.
Yeah.
He didn't eliminate what he didn't think wouldn't fit. He said, I don't know what fits, but I do think these fossils are a clue to our past. And he didn't even think of it as our evolutionary past, but he ended up concluding, there's a process called natural selection and adaptation. And we're still figuring out how the evolutionary process works, but that it worked, that evolution happened, is not in doubt by and large. So that's the analogy I made with, and thank you for seeing that I wanted to be generous toward them. I understood the biases they were bringing were unconscious biases, and John Mack in many ways helped correct for that, because he came in a little later and he already had some opening to spiritual experience through holotropic breathing. He did some psychedelic experiments under controlled circumstances and safely, and he did rituals. So he was a brave guy from Harvard University, being willing to go out among the populace and realize the degree to which he was willing to open his own consciousness would be relevant to what he would find.
Well, he knew that he had to do it, knowing that it was a huge risk. And not only that, crucified by the folks at Harvard because of his outstanding and really weird, crazy ideas. And yet it all played out. And with the years behind that story that he was able to unearth over at Zimbabwe, the kids who experienced it and are now adults talking about what that was like, because at some point, some of them just had to say it didn't happen publicly because there was nowhere to go with it.
Nowhere to go with it. And the one young person I did cover, as you know, a young girl named Emily Trim, 8 years old. And just for your listeners, Zimbabwe was where a sighting happened in 1994. I'm pretty sure it could have been 1993, but I believe it was 1994 at a school called the Ariel School, a private school, international school. This young girl, Emily Trim, and her brother were from Canada. Her parents were, I don't know if they were actually religious missionaries, but it was a very deeply religious family. And I think many of the students were. It might have been a religious school, but in any case, the kids were out on the playground one day. It was almost, again, too remarkable. Beautiful day, slightly hazy, mid-morning, and the teachers and staff were all in a meeting, and the 65 children were out on the playground when a craft of some kind hovered and lowered, and there were more than one craft apparently, although there's some uncertainty about that. The aliens, non-ordinary humanoids, stepped out and were floating and moving in ways that were clearly non-ordinary. Emily, 8 years old, got closer than most. I don't know if it was an act of courage or simple curiosity. And she locked eyes with this deep, dark, black-eyed being, and it had a very powerful effect. She later told John Mack, who flew in for this, that she got messages from this being that we were in danger on Earth of damaging our environment to the point that we would be in trouble. Now, first right there, imagine, is that something that children with an active imagination, by the way, several of the children said they had communication of that kind. Mm-hmm. Well, how likely would it be that they did not all put their stories together? It's known that did not happen. So independently, children saying that was, it doesn't matter, by the way, if it's factual that the Earth is in danger. I think it is in danger. We are in danger in many respects. But the point is, it's not the facticity of it that matters. It's that independently these children came and said they were told this. John Mack said, how did they speak to you? Did they speak in language? She said, oh, no. They spoke to our conscience. And they used the word conscience. And they were meaning consciousness. They said, you mean, how did, through your thoughts? Yes. Their thoughts came into our head and we responded. And we talked thought to thought. I thought that's a remarkable piece of evidence, and not least because of what it suggests. If telepathy happens, it's because we have the capacity for telepathy, in addition to the fact that they do too. So part of what I take away from this is that an issue, an incident after incident, case after case, this phenomenon manages to evoke a larger set of capacities in us as well. That exchange happened on shared ground, common ground, common ontological ground, philosophical, spiritual ground. So in any case, the story about Emily that I think is relevant here is that she went back to Canada. Her parents pulled her out of the school. Her parents effectively said to her, Emily, it didn't really happen. It didn't happen the way you and your brother think. She had a younger brother too. So it's just not what God has in mind for us. So it was a religious objection. It's not in the Bible. Didn't happen. Well, there's all kinds of ways to help children cope, but telling children to not believe direct experience, even when the terms of it are truly incredible. Anyway, that's what the response was. They took the children home. For several years, let's put it mildly, Emily did not thrive. Neither did her brother. They didn't end up in mental hospitals, but they had a series of, their relationships weren't working. They had difficulty holding a job. Finally, one day, Emily got, after a fiance, she and a fiance broke off their relationship, the latest example of what wasn't working. She received a letter from fellow students from the Ariel School decades earlier. It said, Dear Emily, we're having a reunion of the school. We thought it would be a great opportunity for those of us who were in class together to get back together. So she put that down, and she had a moment. She said, I'm going to go. I'm not finished. It's time to finish, to understand what happened. She went back. They had wonderful meetings. The kids who at the time had not talked to each other openly and candidly began to have serious conversations. What was it like for you that day? What was it like not being believed? What did it feel like? Did it really happen? They all agreed that it had happened. They had different memories of how it had happened, which is also a sign of objectivity. If everybody has the same answer, they've rehearsed it. So they didn't have all the same details. In any case, the key point came one day when one of the teachers said, would you like to go visit some of the local indigenous spiritual teachers? She said, well, yeah. How is it we even managed to be here at school? And we didn't even know that outside the boundaries of the school, there was a culture. Well, she goes, yeah, exactly. That was the point. Now you're ready to make contact with the larger culture. And by the way, that was in the area of Zimbabwe where some traditional primitive burial grounds. So that brings in another element of a possible relationship to what had been seen that day. Had it been something of the kind that would be related to a haunting, although it appeared to be a physical craft that was seen by 65 students. In any case, they went to see a teacher, the son of the local spiritual teacher, a man named Duke. I forget his last name. He said, welcome, Emily. Let's take a walk and talk. You've come back to find out what you should do. What are your questions? And then she sort of hemmed and hawed and said, I just am trying to figure out how I'm to relate to all this and what I should say and do. And he said, you must speak of what you saw. You were a child, and it is through the eyes of children and the mouths of children that we learn. You have a duty. And she had to, and that was the moment when she'd recognized her parents had said, "You shall not speak of this." And Duke, 20 years later, said, "You shall speak of this. You shall shout it out." So she shouted it out, and that took the form of going back to Canada, returning to her artwork. She was an accomplished artist, but her artwork was very dark and gloomy and black and white. She began to work with colors. It's almost like a movie. Suddenly, The Wizard of Oz, suddenly the color scenes start to come back. She then began to have insights about her she began to have almost like downloads, if you will, sort of insights that had been bottled up in her. It was like freeing a dam. So I can't give you the exact details of that, but her life began to flourish again. So I connect that. I use the language of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. She completed her hero's journey. She brought some wisdom back to the community, in her case, through her artwork. So did it explain what happened that day? No. But did she come to some deep personal understanding about her role in that? Yes. And that's what I tried to bring forth in this book as often as anything else I covered.
Well, I think it's important that you also included your personal stories, because it gives it that level of understanding that when people have an extraordinary experience, especially something that's like a near-death, out-of-body, transcendent, it changes your perspective as a whole, and I think it opens you up to a greater awareness that what we see here is beyond the physical, and maybe we need to start talking more about that. And you give other people permission to then say, I experienced that too.
And I can tell you, I did not start out the book. I said, in fact, I had decided I was going to write about my experience. I thought it would be in the book after the UFO book. I said, okay, I'm going to, and that was a funny little game I was playing, if you will, a little strategy. I'm going to continue to be objective about the phenomenon as a whole in this UFO book, the UFO Paradox. Then I'll write another book. It'll be a first-person book in which I have a confessional about my own experiences. That would have been one way to do it. But I decided, I went into writing the book not knowing I was going to bring in my own experiences of the paranormal, the metanormal, the supernormal, the supernatural, whatever you want to call it. But it was only in working with the case of Calvin Parker in Pensacola and saw what had happened by him bottling it up and telling the world that his name was Randy when he wasn't really Randy. And then Emily taking, skedoodling back to Canada and with her parents, and then eventually coming back and finishing. I said, my experiences weren't bottled up. I had shared them with friends over the years, so I wasn't dealing quite with the degree of suppression, but it was that I actually felt there was now something important to do that I, as a writer, could model for other writers, that you do not lose your objectivity simply by including your own experience as part of the data. It's with any experience, third person, first person, second person, it's your honoring of the details and bringing true details and checking out claims and checking out experiences. So, yeah, I did not intend to write the book with my own experiences, but in so doing, it truly brought, I guess to use the phrase, downloads. When I made the decision to start writing about my own experience, I actually began to remember details of my own near-death experience. And in other words, I gave my psyche, my psyche said to me, so you're interested in sort of knowing, sort of fully reliving this, right? I mean, this is part of your life for sure, right? I said, yes. So I can't say I had deep prophetic dreams or any great, illuminations, but it was like any experience, like if you've ever lived through a natural disaster. In other words, there was a trauma. My near-death experience was a trauma. Literally, I nearly didn't survive.
Yeah. And
that is part of, and an abduction experience is a deep trauma. So when you open up to the trauma and do work, and I did work with a counselor, a therapist, and with other people, not in the recent period, but in the early days after the experience. Anyway, it was a completion. My writing about it was the next level of completing it and inhabiting it, embodying it. I think what this opportunity we have with this phenomenon is, especially with witnesses and close encounter experiencers is to more fully embody what happened to them. And also the ability to say, if you feel you're in contact with aliens and they are not good aliens, you can say no. In other words, if these are presences, and I'm not in a position where I'm saying, oh, open to whatever comes to you. Well, that isn't necessarily good advice. And it doesn't mean that every presence that might be supernormal is a positive presence. In fact, many spiritual traditions speak of the need to have great discrimination among spirits.
Yeah.
So just as there are many kinds of human nature, people within human nature with different motivations, why wouldn't we say, why, just because a presence doesn't have a body doesn't mean it's trustworthy. There might be malicious spirits out there. So you can also say no to them, but don't deny the reality of it, simply in the name of keeping your worldview intact.
Well, I think it's just the comment, just because somebody died didn't make them any smarter.
That's right.
No guarantee.
A friend of mine was channeling, was interested in channeling. I said, fine, but just don't assume that everything that's a channel, that's coming through you as a channel, is wiser than you are. They don't even have a body. How did that happen?
Yeah.
I've come to realize being a human being is probably one of the great spiritual opportunities. There are said to be realms out there where there are very high beings, and especially in the Buddhist and Hindu cosmologies, esoteric teachings. There are beings that are called devas, and they are so blissed out all the time that they have no aspiration to evolve any further. At another level are beings who are mischievous and dark and unhappy and anxious and angry and not meaning as well. They are sort of stuck. But in the human realm, we have contact with both. We have the capacity to know that our lower nature, meaning the part of us that doesn't want to grow, that's always pushing on us. And then we also can see the higher beings as something we can aspire to and continue to grow into a larger sense of self. So I think being a human is all in all a pretty good metaphysical deal. The soul decided, let's take on human bodies and find out a certain kind of new things that can be understood by limitation of having a body. But that's at least my working attitude toward this world. This world is not often an easy place. We have our travails and ups and downs and setbacks and disappointments. And I continue to find that to the degree that I simply open to whatever my experience is, it's a learning opportunity. And that to me is what's important.
You have done a wonderful job of presenting. There's so much information in here we can't get to. I mean, I was like, how can I cover this in an hour? So I guess that's why people have to read the book. Okay. But there was more in terms of the metaphysics and your visits to Esalen and the holotropic breathing practice. And I really, we didn't get time for that, but that's something I think also adds another element to this, is that spiritual expansion that people experience. And then they have these extraordinary encounters. And where do you go with that? It's not all UFO.
No, it's really not all of UFOs. It doesn't negate the UFO frame or the saucer frame of reference, but it places it in a larger frame of reference. It's in the same sense that when you work, let's imagine you're working with a therapist on some issues, just whatever, your own life, you're trying to grow, and then you realize a therapist says, this is a family issue. Can you bring your whole family in? What? Yeah, bring your whole family. And then it turns out that the therapist who had that idea ended up being called family therapist. And they do work with entire families because it turns out that it's actually maybe the family that has the problem. And lots of different members of the family have their contributions to the collective problem. So it doesn't mean that there isn't still a place for individuals to work in therapy with a counselor or a therapist, but there are times you bring the whole family in. There are workplaces do therapy, right? If you've been in a smart business, sometimes a CEO will realize we've got problems in our company. That's why we need an HR department. Yeah. There's a lot of personnel problems. We're going to have start some sessions where we do some owning. The company gets stronger when those kind of sessions. So I place the phenomenon, the UFO, I use the same metaphor. The UFO phenomenon makes sense in and of itself. It gets more meaningful when it's placed in the context of other things that are anomalies and don't make sense in terms of Western Western philosophy and Western worldview. So I'm an inclusive guy. I'm trying to get to a bigger worldview, and it doesn't involve negating. It involves adding more features.
A community.
Yes, including more of the data.
Yeah.
And Then there's some things you exclude. Doesn't mean it's just a open-ended thing. But let's include everything. I mean, that just can become sloppy thinking. But when you find parallels between any two dimensions of life, you learn by including them. Looks like that over there is connected to this over here. In some ways, it's holistic thinking. Yeah, at its basis, it's just including what is separated, realizing that the lines of separation are also lines of connection.
You got great references in your book. The first one, Angels and Aliens, UFOs and the Mythic Imagination. And this second one, the UFO Paradox, just takes it a step further to what you've also included as your own perspective and your own experience and expands it. And I think with Robert Bigelow involved, and he moved beyond the UFO to the Skinwalker Ranch, where the metaphysical, the consciousness, and now the after death, that issue is primary, front and center on his plate. I think that speaks to the expansion of this whole topic, this area that we are just now beginning to believe beyond the physical nuts and bolts to the spiritual, metaphysical aspect, and that's an expansion of consciousness. Does that make sense?
It really does. I must say, I really appreciate that you have clearly read the work. I say that not because it's a pat on the back for me, but I talk with people who, they'll have the 10 questions that they think the UFO phenomenon is about, and they'll say, I didn't have time to read your book, but I've got some questions about the UFO phenomenon in general. I'm happy to talk with that person. It's you talk with everybody before they are, but you clearly prepared yourself, and so I thank you for helping, me engage the topic in the spirit that I tried to do in the book. Really appreciate it.
I'm looking forward to the next one when you explore more of your own metaphysical stuff. Okay, just pour it out.
That seems to be where I'm going. And I can give you a little bit of a hint. I'm going to explore more deeply into what death is about, and it's from the same standpoint of exploration. There were many experiences I've had in addition to my own. And I can tell you that what happened as a result of my near-death experience is what came or what disappeared. And I no longer had any fear of death. When I came back from the edge of dying and was convinced I was dead, there was a time when I left my body. It was a near drowning experience. And I remember looking down at my body from some perspective that I said, well, this is amazing. I used to be seeing the world from that body that I now see in the ocean, which is something I'm now seeing. So I'm a perspective that is not limited to that body. And I see my friends on the shore calling me, Keith, come, because they couldn't get out. The waves were, they understood the waves were as bad as they were when I didn't realize it. I got caught in body surfing and just taken out very fast. So long story short, that experience of, dead isn't dead. That was a realization I had out there. So I came back with really, I can't say I achieved the loss of fear of death. It wasn't an achievement. I'm not afraid of dying, and because I'm convinced the proper distinction is not between life and death, but birth and death. We're born and we die as this body. But life is the process in which that takes place. It isn't life, then death. It's birth and death. And I'm convinced life continues in various forms. There's too much empirical evidence about it. And I also was with my mother when she died in a hospice. That'd be another hour story, but I experienced her deathbed presence of clearly when were relatives and friends coming to take my mother at the very end of her life. And I think the reason I was open to that, Wendy, was because I had let go a certain degree of fear and defensive boundary between this life and the next had just disappeared. So when I was with my mother, just two of us, I could hear music that was not of this world. And I heard murmurings, and my mother was being taken. And by the way, it's a great deal of evidence for deathbed visitations. It's a very common thing. Other cultures have it. So the issues around death and dying, I think, are important. And I like to help people feel. I like to give people confidence that this is part of a larger. Nothing ever ends. I'm pretty convinced. I don't know what form it takes in the next phase, but nothing ever ends.
I think it's called research.
Yeah, called research, writing about it, living it. And it's not that some things don't end, the body does end, but it's who we are really, I don't think ever ends.
I agree.
Anyway, there's a lot of evidence. And Robert Bigelow in Las Vegas, an entrepreneur in a whole other area of life, made a great deal of money, and he has helped endow important research into consciousness and the after death.
Keith, have you shared that experience with Robert Bigelow?
No, I don't know him very well, but I have been in touch with him, and as you know, I wrote a chapter in the book called The Bigelow Factor, in which I simply celebrated that, like Rockefeller, he put his philanthropy to work on some very unusual things. So I probably will share that with Bigelow, at least in writing.
Well, absolutely. That's what he has been researching, and he has a compilation now from one of the previous contests where you could...
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, and asking for proof of the afterlife, that kind of thing. But since you have a little bit of a connection with him, I'm sure he would welcome your information as well.
That's probably true. And he was gracious enough, his organization was gracious enough to give me a set of the volumes from that essay contest. So I consider that I have in my living room, in a 5-volume set of books, everything that is, it's imagine like the Alexandra Library or something from another era. I have the premier evidence around death and dying in my living room. You can't ask for more.
Mine is on the truck. Mine is on the truck.
Okay.
I hope it's arriving soon.
Oh, terrific. Well, I'm glad to hear it. I think I understand that. I know some other people who are expecting their own. Again, this is Bigelow. He's a fantastic spirit in terms of enabling this kind of research.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate, the information you're working on. I appreciate the level you go to try and you do a fair and balanced presentation. I know that can be hard when you're dealing with so many personalities and egos, but you've certainly given people a lot of information to work with to expand their own horizons and learn more about what's going on from all sides of what we consider the UFO aspect. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for meeting me here. Here meaning in this conversation that we've had, so that we can. This is a groundwork for whatever we're both going to do next.
The UFO Paradox: The Celestial and Symbolic World of Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. Keith's website is thompsonatlarge.com. Links are in the description for the show. Keith offered a quote that I thought stood out, and it's worth repeating. So the final word from Keith Thompson.
There's a philosopher named Sir William Crook who studied the paranormal back in Victorian England, and he was challenged by a debunker type. He said, "I never said it was possible. I only said it was true."
Thanks for listening.